presentation. It has been, how to say, very deep because not everyone here actually has watched the movie, so it's maybe quite hard for everyone to follow it, but maybe you can clarify the point from time to time. So, yeah, many things for us to ponder upon actually. I guess it would be great if I can start with an initial response and also some questions, like continuous questions for you. So, one of the few things that I would like to know more from you is how are we actually looking at the changing nature of cosmopolitanism? And how does it actually being represented, continuously being represented in Malaysia? Because, for example, you're starting with the questions of Malaysian film landscape, because you are referring to the context where film production and filmmakers ecosystem in Malaysia. Because, for example, you mentioned about the independent filmmakers earlier on, about how they actually conceptualize or actually physically actualizing the concept of transethnic solidarities, where you can see people from multilingual landscape, multilingual capabilities actually coming together to produce what we might term as Malaysian movies. But then again, if we're looking at the historical traces in Malaysia, we are aware on how Malaysian cinema during its golden age, during 1950s, 1960s, during Kate craze and then also Shaw Brothers, it has always been there. The cosmopolitanism of what might we perceive as people with transethnic, people from different backgrounds actually coming over together. Even what is more interesting is even, for example, the first film about Hantua is actually being made by Indian nationality. So you can see, because Hantua actually epitomized what we understood as a Malay traditional hero of now. Like you can see in Malaysia, it was being appropriated by the political Malay right wing in Malaysia. So it's the symbol of political Malay right wing. But then again, we can see how people during at that particular age of golden age cinema in Malaysia, the people who actually depict Hantua is actually of Indian nationalities. So you can see how cosmopolitan it can be at that time. But then again, how can we actually trace back the production during the production of golden age cinema to the what you call as the internet babies just now? And then maybe I'm also looking at this particular moment, like the historical periodization from the golden age cinema from 50s until the contemporary production. How is it possible for this kind of moment actually delinks Malaysian film production beyond the Western film aesthetics? Because it might actually provide us with the possibility for Malaysian film to produce a condition to rethink and respond to the questions of modernity. Because what we produce during that particular age of golden age of Malaysian cinema at that time, or maybe we have to term it as Malaya cinema at that time, is the convergence of different genre, for example. So it may be not quite direct in that sense, but how can we actually establish relational? Because from there, we can understand how do we position Malaysian film. And then maybe another thing that I would love to quote directly from you is, you mentioned about the independents were cosmopolitan in the sense of working across ethnic barriers. This is in your paper, where I found it very important, because cosmopolitanism here, maybe I would love to bring it into a more nuanced perspective, because it's just not merely just to be confined within the logic where signify openness to other people's culture, embracing plurality. So I guess, how can we actually go beyond this kind of cosmopolitanism? Because in here, we can see how this kind of cosmopolitanism was then being appropriated. For example, you mentioned with how Mahathir, with his ideas of Islam, and it actually transpired to Yasmin Ahmad's film. So this kind of cosmopolitanism, then, how can we actually negotiate the boundary of cosmopolitanism, of how the state perceives it, and how the negotiation happens from below, especially from those who produce this kind of production of film, for example. So I guess another thing which is very important is like the ideas of competing narratives. So at the end you mentioned about different ideas, different narrative that is very much prevalent in Malaysian society. You can actually see the convergence of Islam, but what kind of Islam are we talking about? If we're going to talk about the concept of a nation, is it a Malay-centric nation, or is it like a nation that is we continuously envision, for example? So this is the thing that I'm interested to know more from your insights after this. And then, yes.
Before I forget.
Sure, yeah, so, yeah, sure. All right, okay. Sorry.
Okay. Okay, thank you for those questions. I wish you told me earlier. I think first of all, to kind of talk about the cosmopolitanism today among the Indies and the cosmopolitanism of the golden era. I think it's important to note that there are different definitions of what I mean by cosmopolitan. Because off screens, like the people working on a film, when you look at the credits rolling, you see who's behind it. That's one thing. But what you see on screen, the actors and the stories that are being told, is another thing. Right? So, like with the Malay golden era, you had Chinese producers, Indian directors, sometimes Filipino directors, but the actors and the stories that were being told were Malay stories. Right? So people like Joe Kahn also said that, at first there's this notion that those films are cosmopolitan in that sense because they're kind of a collective effort. But actually they're not, because the stories are aimed at the Malays of the 50s. The stories are aimed towards the Malay audience, and they only became multicultural. Somebody said that it was only after the film got on TV, after the PMV films made it on TV, that different audiences across different ethnic backgrounds got to watch them more. Because, because sorry, sometimes they might have been shown outdoors in the cinemas, but there's no telling. I'm not sure what the record is and what evidence there is to say that the people who went to the films back then were actually males. Yeah. So that's one. The other thing is beyond Western film styles. The early films, the pure early films are very interesting, right? Because they do take influences from elsewhere, and Vander Hai argues in a way that Malaysian cinema has always been kind of transnational. I mean, he might not use the word transnational, but he kind of meant that they were already Asian cinema or they were already international, because he had influences from Japanese directors. Because during the war, before they watched Ozu, and there's that tracking shot, that famous Rashomon tracking shot that people claim you can see in Semerang Padi. So, and a few other references to Japanese classic directors. So there's that, and also if you watch some of the comedies there, you know they're popular. They make references to pop culture, right? Because they were pop culture then, so they would make references. They would have Latin music because that was the trend then. They had Labu dan Labi doing cowboy scenes. There's a kind of parody of a western in there, right? So it is of its time. And today, it's just that the time what we have today is all action. And Nangron would be able to tell us more detail about how we're locked into particular genres because they're the ones that can make money, that can draw people to come to the cinemas. Well, I mean, if you look at today's filmmakers, they're not just referring to American or Western cinema. They're also referring to Japanese films and Taiwanese films and Hong Kong films and film influences from many places. So it's not just Western. There's something about different narratives that are dealing with regards to Islam. The Mahathir Islam. So in another article I wrote about Yasmin Ahmad's films and why was Yasmin Ahmad so why did they target her? Why did they shoot her down? Why did they criticize her? And they are the ethno-nationalists, right? The people who are protecting Malay culture to be something that is unadulterated and something that is not hybrid, that is somehow pure. Yeah, so what she was doing, I argue, is showing in Islam that actually some people claim don't exist in Malaysia. Right? And as Namron also will tell you that in Kubra, his character is actually modeled after an Indonesian Ustaz, right? Yeah. So who is somebody who lived with sex workers and had no issue with them, or did not judge them. So the Yasmin Ahmad films, it's very difficult to kind of pin down cosmopolitanism, because in Malaysia, so cosmopolitanism can be used in so many different ways. It's such a convenient and loose framework in some ways. Because the idea of going beyond your borders and finding something in common with people beyond your national borders, your cultural borders, is there when you talk about the Ummah, the Muslim, the world of Muslims that are that transcend ethnic and national boundaries. So Mahathir's audience varies. So Mahathir's speech varies according to his audience. And so in that way, cosmopolitanism or Islam, whatever, is convenient for that kind of audience. So you can use cosmopolitanism to talk about different types of Islam, but it's going to be saying that we all, despite having different schools of thought, are still Muslim. But in Malaysia, we're not like that. In Malaysia, there's only one kind of Islam that the state supports, but on the ground it's different. So trying to compare what Mahathir says, Mahathir's Islam, and then what Yasmin actually does, it's not quite comparable. Even though what I'm trying to say is that she uses parts of it. She sees the world as. When you see this in Mu'allaf, because there's a scene at the end which, if you are of a Western non-Muslim thinker, you're like, and you're a feminist, you're like, no, how could she? But if you buy this idea of there not being two worlds, there is that you have to have faith, and being Muslim means you have to do these things, then you become more tolerant of differences. Yeah, I don't think I answered your question.
Because my question also quite broad in a sense. But I would love to know more, because you mentioned about, in a way, how I understood it as the limitation of cosmopolitanism. Because you mentioned about how is it possible for us to go beyond the limitation that we have. So is it possible for you to explain more, what kind of condition actually disallow cosmopolitanism?
Because it depends on how you use it, right? So you can use cosmopolitanism to talk about Malays feeling for So I have, for example, a Malay friend who says, why do you feel solidarity with the Palestinian? You're not Muslim. I'm like, oh, but I'm a human being, right? So I'm using cosmopolitan to say we're all human beings, regardless of regardless of our religion. But other people have used Islam and the Ummah as a kind of unifying factor that transcends national borders. But in Malaysia, we can use that to cross borders, but how come you want to connect with the Muslims over there, but you don't want to connect with the Chinese and the non-Muslims over here? What's your problem, right? So if you're actually cosmopolitan, you use it to be open to many people who don't agree with you. You have to also respect them. You cannot exclude them. So this is the problem. Yeah.
So maybe just like another ideas that I'm looking at is the question of liminality, because you mentioned the liminal subjects, which is quite significant in both Dukun and Interchange. Liminal here, from what I understood, is the disorientation, the process of transition. For example, like the main character in Interchange is like, how to say, a deformed Birdman, for example. So is the transition, is it a human or is it an animal, for example? And in Dukun, it's a question of like what ritual killing, like the disorientation of what exactly within facts and fiction, or what is actually a belief or something that is we rationalize from time to time. So this kind of disorientation or liminal subject is quite prevalent in the film. So, but at the same time, I'm also looking at the potential of liminality as both it can be emancipatory and also it can be quite what we call as violence. Because in here, what I'm looking at is for example, what I try to conceptualize between the how liminal subject can be violence and also emancipatory is because, for example, the violence process in the film of Interchange is where we can see the Tinggang tribe, the process of subjectivation, which is ever present in both films. You can see where, for example, how the Tinggang tribe tried to reclaim its own identity, but then again, it was being suppressed or repressed by the logic that we understood at a particular time. And then another one is the hybrid condition of modernity in Dukun, where you can see the ambivalence of justice. It's either you go through the institutional apparatus, through the court justice, and what about the ritual justice? Is there no justice within the ritual killing, for example? So this kind of violence yet emancipatory liminality is something that I would love to know more, because I guess that's something that I would love to know more from your perspective. Yeah, is it possible for you to speak more about it?
So for example, in Interchange, when the Tinggangs are released, basically they are killed and then have their blood drained out to release their spirit. Right? So of course this is a very violent thing, physically violent, but there's also epistemic violence. And epistemic violence is already done to them in the beginning. And it's done, I think I've outlined all the numerous ways it's done in this sort of clean, clear, logical way that we don't regard as violence. So when we actually see that kind of graphic violence, actually we don't see it. We only see the end of it, and the end of it is not very graphic because there's no blood. And it's almost like in an interview, Dain said it was just like an homage to this tribe. And it's almost beautiful. It's like video installation. It's like an installation, the deaths, the ritual deaths. So I'm not saying that it's right to do that, but I'm kind of saying that you have epistemic violence that's done to them in the beginning, and then so this kind of violence is just, well, I don't want to quote Fanon here, but you know, it's that kind of trying to understand that there's an effect to that. So what is the difference between this violence with the violence that was done to them? So that's my answer. The liminality as emancipatory or as violence. So that's one. I think at first when I watched Interchange first, and then Dukun came out. I watched Dukun, and you will see that there are similarities in the noir style, in the way things are shot, and then the kind of story too. And the characters, they're kind of stock characters in these films now, I can see. But they are actually very different. And when you read them closely, they're different because in Dukun, you have the ambivalence of justice, but you cannot really take her position. You feel empathy because the case is argued well, right? But it's very different in terms of how life and death is portrayed. So in Dukun, life, you see the film opens in the past, in the 1960s, and in Aceh, in the Batak lands. Okay? So a violent thing occurs over there, and then the magic staff is transported away from that violence on the road that's still rural, and then that scene kind of joins up. Joins up into modern day Kuala Lumpur on the expressway. Right, so you see the past continues into the present, and that tradition continues right through the staff, the magic staff. And then at the end you see that there are references to an ancient symbol called the Ouroboros. So the Ouroboros is the snake that eats its own tail. So it kind of means constant renewal. So that when there's death, there's also birth. Right? And when there's birth, there's death. So it makes sense because in the end, she dies, but actually her power continues to live on. But in Interchange, they want to die. That's the end of the road for them. Right? So it's more linear. We don't know what happens after that. It's not cyclical in this way. Yeah. There's a symbolism of water in Interchange, but I can't quite make much. I can't make enough out of it yet to give you a clear sense. But I think in Interchange, water is very important. It plays a role. It comes up over and over again. I suspect it has something to do with this, the hydrocyclic part of nature of water. That water is also magical. Because every time you see a murder, there's water. There's water on the road. They're walking through a puddle. There's rain. She eats ice. So again, a form of water. And then at the end of it, when he becomes a hornbill, he flies up to the sky. So there's one of the murders take place in sky sauna. Right? And when when the cops arrive at the scene, there's steam coming up, and the cop has to say "potong steam." So there's water appears in different forms in the film, and at the end of it, water goes back to the sky, just like the hornbill goes back. So the hornbill is actually the messenger between this world, physical world, and Samyang, the god of in the sky. So the hornbill takes food and its people, the watches over the people up and connect to the god in the sky. So somehow water facilitates that process of connection between the physical world and the spiritual world. I think. There you have it.
Yeah. So. Before I open the floor to our audience, maybe just one last question, because coming back again to the question, the condition of liminality in Malaysia, for example, because in Interchange and Dukun. Although Interchange, it takes much more, how to say, you can say it's more like magical realism kind of perspective. But then again, it's very significant because we are looking at the present body of precarious body of migrant workers, for example, which like persona non grata. We are a body, a middle of nowhere. And then also the question of the indigenous customary rights to land, for example. So it might provide us with the understanding about the question of precarity and agency within the Malaysian society. So when we are looking at the question of like liminal subject, the question of precariousness, how do you see it being represented in Dain Said films? And as a whole, how does it affect or influence the way we're looking at the Malaysian society? Yeah.
Well, hopefully with this new government, that it will actually open up for more of these representations. So these representations do come out in actually the Freedom Film Fest that has been going on since 2003, where it's a documentary film festival that supports people to make films based on human rights. So every year there will be a theme, and based on that year, particular issues that are sometimes more hot topics of that year will come out. A lot of those films have been about migrant workers' rights, about indigenous people, about land rights, the loss of land due to development and deforestation, workers' rights, women's rights, indigenous women having problems getting to hospitals or healthcare. So yeah, it's there, and it's already started to creep in to Malaysian films from 2010 onwards, and we'll see, of course, with Tamina's film afterwards or in the next few days. We'll see it in One Two Jaga. We'll see it in a film that's not playing here, Tiger Factory, where you had Chin refugees playing characters in the film. So they are there, and the nice thing too is it's not just these these representations of migrant workers is now becoming a regional thing. I mean, there was a Taiwanese film here too, right? Which portrayed the relationship between an Indonesian worker and a Filipino worker some years ago. And there's also Singaporean films that do that, Ilo Ilo. Yeah, and now a new Thai film that's doing that with Burmese illegal fishing, sort of a Burmese refugee or something, and the relationship between Thais and this sort of Burmese man who arrives. Yeah. So I think that more and more filmmakers, independent filmmakers, are turning to these subjects. And it's great. I mean, hopefully with this new government in place, we can test the waters more.
So you're very optimistic with the government. So we would like to open the questions. Yeah, Prof. Joyce.
Thank you. I'm very interested in the concept you mentioned concerning this Nusantara is a plenary space for knowledge production that is combining or acknowledging different disciplines like anthropology and biology and other things. The concept of Nusantara, either it is as a pan-Malaya or a pan-Indonesia. It indicates the larger area of this outer island, right? An outer island as a whole. So this concept has its possibility to be appropriated in a nationalistic way, right? Not to mention in the beginning of, in like 13th or 12th centuries, they used it to fight against the expansion of the Mongolian invasion. So the concept arrived, started in the text. But then, of course, it was used later on in maybe 20th century as a revival of a nationalistic geopolitics space, right? So when we want to talk about different modes of modernity, as you quoted